Her hands trembled around the clipboard long before the nurse called her name. The paper meant nothing, just routine questions about headaches and family history, but the waiting room was small and the air was thick with other people's breathing, and every chair felt like a test of composure she had to pass. Sophie Bennett kept her eyes low, palms flat, pretending the pen was heavier than it was, so she had something to do besides listen to the way other people moved without thinking. A cough, a laugh, the scrape of a heel against linoleum, each of those ordinary sounds sat in her like a spotlight. Across from her, a plant drooped in a plastic pot, its soil cracked. Sophie traced a faint line in the grain of the clip with a fingertip, a nervous map she knew well. When the door to the exam rooms opened and a man in a white coat stepped into the corridor, the air rearranged itself inside her chest. He was younger than she'd expected, a clean jaw, a soft crease by the eye that hinted at too many late nights. And his presence did something impartial and dangerous. It made the room smaller, as if the world had tilted toward him. Dr. Daniel Hayes introduced himself with a voice that belonged to people you trusted without trying. Steady, practiced, an edge of kindness he had not learned from textbooks. He smiled in a way that measured warmth. By habit, Sophie's shoulders dropped a fraction. She told herself to look at the clipboard. She told herself to breathe. She told herself not to notice how his eyes found hers for a second before he shifted his attention to the nurse standing in the doorway. "Miss Bennett?" he asked. She could hear the syllables of her name as if spoken from behind glass. Her voice when she replied was thinner than she intended. "Yes." He reviewed her chart with the kind of concentration that made him professional and not performative. He asked the necessary questions in the necessary order. He did not press on the things she tried to keep private, no extraneous small talk about her job or the way her fingers trembled when she wrote her address. He found a balance between clinical efficiency and ordinary human decency, and Sophie recognized the difference with a clenching relief that felt dangerously like gratitude. When he asked if she had any allergies, she almost said the wrong thing. The names of a few men who had learned too quickly how to be gentle and had used it like a promise. She closed her mouth and said instead, "No." The plant by the window needed watering, he said, and she realized he was talking about anything but plants. He laughed, a soft sound, and then he walked out. He carried confirmation of his appointment times and the neat, quiet certainty of someone who had learned to hold distance like medicine. She found, later, that she watched for that certainty. Outside the clinic window, the city moved on. The air smelled like rain and fried dough and 1,000 small errands.
Sophie stood at the bus stop for a long time, clutching the clipboard to her chest as if it were a shield. In the pocket of her cardigan was a thin, dog-eared bookmark with frayed edges, a small thing that should not have mattered. Tucked into the fold of that scrap of paper was a faded Polaroid, a child with a bandaged knee and a paper crane in her hand, the edges softened by thumbprints, and on the back, in a loopy hand, the single word Hayes. She had not meant to put the Polaroid there, not in any deliberate way. It always seemed to find that spot, like an old coin in a pocket. The photograph was a relic of a winter a decade ago, when the world had felt precarious and someone had taught her to fold her fears into paper wings. It had been a small kindness then, a stranger in a blue jacket handing her a crane and letting her keep it. The note on the photo had been all she had, an afterthought scrawled on the back as if whoever wrote it hadn't expected to be remembered. When Daniel eased into the hallway to call the next patient, he did it with the same unhurried efficiency he used in his work, hands precise, posture measured. He moved through rooms like someone who was always careful to stand where he would not shadow another's light. Sophie noticed and then chastised herself for noticing. She told herself not to look twice, but the memory in the pocket seemed to notice for her. The word on its back, a small, private echo she could not place. On her way home from the clinic that afternoon, she detoured, as she always did when anxiety was heavy in her, into the narrow bookstore she worked at. The bellwether had once been a hardware store. It still smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil. Sophie had a routine there. Shelve the new arrivals, restack the classics, close the gap between spine and shelf like a promise. The job was uncomplicated. It required hands that could be trusted with paper and eyes that could find a quiet passage in the middle of chaos. She slid into the morning shift and folded herself around the comfortable hum of the shop. The bell over the door chimed occasionally. Customers came and left. The world outside kept moving at its chaotic, undignified pace. Sophie kept her Polaroid as if it were an amulet. Sometimes she would take it out and smooth it on the counter so she could look at the tiny paper crane and remind herself that a kindness had once happened to her, and that kindness had not been bought. It had been given. Later that week, Daniel appeared among the stacks like a punctuation mark, unexpected, gentle, unobtrusive. He picked up a copy of a book with a cover Sophie loved and pretended to browse. She watched him from the cash register, as a clerk is allowed to watch without being improper. He did not look like the headline of a glossy profile she'd stumbled upon earlier on a friend's phone. Hayes Foundation raises millions, young philanthropist at the helm.
The picture online had been of a man in a tuxedo, hosting a gala, surrounded by cameras and speeches. Daniel in the shop stood in the penumbra between the biographies and the travel guides, an ordinary silhouette disrupted only by the quiet way he read the back cover of a book as if the words mattered to him. He noticed her then, in the way people do who have been taught to see. He lowered the book to its place on the shelf and crossed to the counter with the same careful feet he used inside the clinic. "Ms. Bennett," he said, and the name on his lips in that setting was less formal, less measured by a chart entry. "You work here." Her throat tightened, and she wished for the anonymity of the shelf. "I do," she said, "part-time, mostly mornings." He asked for a recommendation, something light, a book that could be read on a train and then left in the pocket of a stranger who might need it. Sophie nearly blurted out the first thing that came to mind, but she folded her answer carefully, as if tucking a fragile thing into its proper place. "Try this," she said, handing him a slim novel with a creased spine. "It's quiet where it needs to be." He smiled, as if he had expected nothing less. He paid with a card and left a generous tip, which made her mouth form words she did not speak. Gratitude and humiliation braided together. She liked him a little less for it, an ugly human reaction. She had spent years practicing dignity on an economy that seemed to assume worth was purchased, and suddenly the boy from the gala who could command rooms had left a coin on the counter like an apology he didn't think he owed. After he left, Sophie wiped the counter with slow, deliberate motions that were meant to calm. She thought of the Polaroid in her pocket, the neat cursive Hayes on the back, like a secret that wanted to be read but not spoken. She pushed away images. Daniel at a fundraising dinner, Daniel in a tuxedo, Daniel with a whole economy of influence. She told herself not to be that woman who asked if a man could cover her rent. She had been accused, quietly by her own shame, of wanting less for herself and more for her pockets, and the accusation had a voice she recognized, the soft internal one that told her to step back from anything resembling risk. In the days that followed the bookstore visit, Daniel showed up more in public spots Sophie frequented. He did not schedule these appearances the way someone stalks a life. They were soft encroachments, sitting at the cafe 2 tables over when she came in to steal an hour with a paperback, attending a small reading where she worked the desk, leaving a polite observational comment about the weather that ended with a nod to the bookstore's arrangement of poetry. He did not offer grand gestures. He did not make a spectacle. He was present in the way rain is present, inescapable but not aggressive.
She told herself it was easier to breathe when he was a known quantity of kindness, but that was only part of the truth. Part of the truth was that she felt herself under a microscope, measuring whether she would look like someone who wanted something from him. The world had taught her an ugly economy. Sympathy sometimes masqueraded as leverage, and wealth was a currency that could erase the edges of a person. She had learned to shrink so she would not be accused of using the warmth of another to buy a place in her life. One evening, as she shelved a new box of donated paperbacks, Sophie slipped the Polaroid out to breathe. She pressed the photograph flat between two fingers, as if she could iron out the years. The paper crane in the child's hands was still roughly formed, the folds imperfect. On the back, the word haze had faded, ink feathered by time and the elements, but it was there, a small, stubborn mark she had kept like a relic. She did not have a narrative for why she had kept that photograph. It was not a keepsake of a particular person, no lover, no parent. It was a memory of a kind act, the sort of thing that proves to you that when the world tips, there are people who will make an effort to catch you. She had been 8 when the photograph had been taken, and the kindness had come during a cold season of her childhood when the furnace had failed and her mother had taken too many shifts and her brother had been too young to understand anything but hunger. The world then had been all edges and small worrying noises. A volunteer in a blue jacket, someone who had tie-dyed hair and freckles, had handed Sophie a paper crane at a makeshift children's table in a hospital, and for a moment she had been ordinary. Someone had knelt at eye level and asked her about her favorite color. Someone had smiled and made space for her fragility in a way she had never expected. On the back of the Polaroid, the volunteer had written a name and a drawn heart. Sophie had kept it because it was proof that gentleness existed without demand. It had been years since anyone gave her a folded piece of kindness without wanting something back. When the day came that she read an article aloud to herself in the back room, a reporter's easy praise of a foundation event where a member of the Hayes family had funded a wing of the community clinic, she felt the air leave her like a balloon. The article was glossy and breezy, a human interest fluff piece about a handsome, philanthropic heir who chose to give back to the city. The photograph that accompanied the piece was of a man in a dark suit shaking hands with a mayoral aide and laughing in a way that made the headline writer call him charismatic. The caption read, simply, Daniel Hayes. Sophie put the magazine down as if it burned. She had not wanted to find him there, not in that image. The revelation read like a verdict. He had money, he had status. She understood immediately the shape of the accusation the world might make, that she smiled for a shelf rather than a salary. She folded the magazine and put it in the discard pile. The Polaroid she cradled suddenly became an accusation of its own. The word on its back read like a challenge. Had that kindness been tied to his name all along? She decided then to step back. If she could not trust herself to be unconflicted, she would give Daniel the dignity of distance. She wrapped herself in invisibility the way she wrapped old sweaters, practical, familiar, safe. He noticed. People with a practice of being kind often noticed when someone shrank away. Daniel, who was quick in a clinic and slower in his personal life, saw the change as if through a pane of glass. The way she made her sentences shorter, the way she avoided the cafe when she suspected he might be there, the way her hands, after their first meeting, would not settle in his presence. He respected her silence outwardly, no messages that hinted at a life of privilege or implied ownership of attention, but privately he felt the cold nibbling at his chest. There were reasons he had learned to hold distance, reasons that had nothing to do with patient confidentiality and everything to do with scars. He had been betrayed once by someone who had promised intimacy and then turned it into leverage. The memory of that betrayal sat under his ribs like an old flinty pebble, always there and easy to feel. He had built rules around it: no mixing work and feelings, no courting patience, keep things compartmentalized. He believed in boundaries because the alternative had left him brutalized. And yet he kept finding ways to be present. He walked past the bellwether on purpose sometimes, not to intervene, but to watch the way the light pooled on the counter where she liked to rest, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when reading, the small habits that made her human and not a headline. He would stop by the cafe and pick up a pastry to go, leaving the shop with crumbs on his cuff, and he told himself that smallness was the only honest way forward. His presence was a question more than an answer. Could gentleness be enough once it had earned the right to ask for a place?
Sophie, meanwhile, carved careful spaces in her life where he did not appear. She reoriented her routes, took a different table at the cafe, closed early some nights to avoid the possibility of coincidence. She told herself distance would be protection. She told herself it was dignity. It was both and neither, a complicated arithmetic that left a residue of longing in her evenings. The days moved with the sort of slow insistence that allows worry to expand. She came to the shop, shelved, and went home to a small flat above a dry cleaner's, where the radiator banged like bones against the pipes in the darkest hours. She put the Polaroid on the nightstand and told herself she kept it for no reason besides the fact that kindness had once been given to her without a tax. Then, one afternoon, after an exhausting morning stacking boxes too heavy for her shoulders and a temperate argument with a customer about the appropriate care for first editions, Sophie walked to the corner store for milk. The weather had been a study in indecision. A cloud might pour or not, and the sky had a nervous look of its own. She was tired the way a person with no cushion against life is tired, bone deep and present. She was halfway across the street when the world slipped. It was not a grand collapse. There were no cinematic flares or heroic orchestras. One moment she was negotiating the crosswalk and counting her steps the way she'd been taught to count breaths, keeping everything small and manageable. The next moment, something inside her gave out like a seam unstitched. The knees folded, the sky tilted. The bread in her bag thudded against her thigh and then slipped to the pavement. Heads turned. A gust of wind raised a pile of discarded receipts and sent them into a small, frantic ballet. Daniel was across the street. She would later try to disentangle the improbable geometry of how quick he had been. But for now, in the sliding, shape-shifting present, he was already at her side. He touched her elbow with the practiced calm of someone who had been taught to act in emergencies, but the kindness in his touch came first, and protocol came after, like a well-trained muscle that had remembered how to serve compassion before guidelines. "Miss Bennett," he said, but the syllables were different now. He was calm, but his calm had concern threaded through it. He cupped the back of her head to steady it, removed the bag from her hands with a single motion, and in the minutes that followed, he became both stranger and lifeline. An onlooker called 911. An EMT reached them and took over with a battery of questions, their voice clipped and efficient. Daniel stepped back into the periphery, letting the professionals do what professionals did. He handed over his card when asked his name, and when the EMT asked if she was a patient of his, he answered truthfully but carefully, "She has been seen at my clinic," and the world in that sentence felt tight as a drum. The ambulance lights painted the storefronts in a slow, worried blue. The monitor beeped somewhere distant as the EMTs loaded Sophie onto a stretcher. Her breath was shallow, breath like a whisper. She felt the Polaroid in the pocket of her cardigan as if it were a second heart. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just faintness from an empty lunch hour, from too many shifts, from being a person who kept gentleness in a jar and dispensed it in teaspoons. Daniel stayed, not in the demanding way of someone claiming authority, but in the soft insistence of presence. He spoke to the EMTs where protocol required it, answered one or two questions about medications, none, and then stepped aside. There was no attempt to make a scene, no leverage of white coat to hold sway. He folded his hands and watched as they strapped her fast and wheeled her into the back of the ambulance. He slipped the Polaroid from the pocket of her cardigan before the EMT had a chance to fold it into a plastic bag. The gesture was quick and respectful, as if he knew the thing belonged to her and would be lost if it were not kept close. In the ambulance, under the halogen strip and the steady beep of monitors, Sophie became profoundly small and utterly exposed. The EMTs asked about allergies, about medication, and she answered with the brittle, efficient honesty someone gives when they are not certain of the language of their body. She held the Polaroid in her palm like a talisman and thought of paper cranes and winters and strangers who had given her a minute without asking for anything in return. Daniel rode in a separate vehicle, but he was at the hospital when she arrived.
He moved through admission with the professional courtesy of a man who had seen illness in many forms, and yet whose hands remembered the gentleness he believed in. There were forms to sign, a curtain to draw, an intake nurse who shuffled through the necessary paperwork with a clipboard like a judge. Sophie allowed herself to be attended to with a kind of exhausted compliance she had practiced as a child when the adults around her were too busy to notice sadness unfold. In the fluorescent hush of the ER, she drifted in and out of awareness. The monitor at her bedside registered a heartbeat that was rhythmically stubborn. A nurse checked her pupils and asked if she had eaten that day. She had, in the way a person counts out the hours with coffee and small insufficient things. Sophie felt apologetic for the trouble she was causing, apologetic in that internalized way that made a person responsible for other people's time. Daniel sat in a plastic chair 2 yards away and watched. Up close, he looked less like the glossy magazine image and more like a man who had learned to contain himself because he had once been too much undone. The set of his jaw was less resolute than when he saw patients in his clinic. His control here had a tenderness to it that was almost tender in its private failure. He fiddled once with the edge of a napkin he had found at the vending machine. He glanced at Sophie as if to read her the way he read a chart, carefully, breath by breath. Finally, when the immediate rush of care had subsided to a watchful stillness, he leaned forward and spoke without the guardrails he usually wore. "You fainted in the crosswalk," he said, not a question but a fact traded between people who had found themselves in an emergency together. "Do you remember anything?" Her eyes met his, gray in the artificial light, and for a moment a longer truth hovered between them, that she did not remember the geometry of falling, but she remembered the sensation of being caught. "A hand," she said, "a hand and a voice. It sounded like someone being careful." He exhaled silently. He had watched her as the EMT loaded her into the ambulance, had seen the way she folded into that smallness, and for reasons he could not entirely parse, some combination of professional responsibility and the part of him that wanted to be closer, he had stepped in. He had done what was necessary. He would not make claims. He would not offer gifts. He would do what a doctor does when the world frays: show up and stay steady. In the hush between monitors, something even newer had to be navigated: the way his presence and her vulnerability braided into a moment of private revelation. He remembered, with an unexpected clarity, his own habit of collecting small, simple things to anchor him: a heavy-eyed photograph of his father, a cufflink he never wore. He had kept rules for good reason, but the image of Sophie on the stretcher, small and honest in a way that was not performative, started another thought he had not expected to entertain. Outside, the rain started without much drama, the city deciding at last to give what the sky had been threatening. Inside, Sophie's breath regulated and then stuttered, a small tide. Daniel watched the Polaroid she had always kept tucked in her pocket when she visited the clinic. Now it lay on the bedside table between them, its edges catching the fluorescent light like a promise that had not yet been fulfilled. He had not looked at it closely yet. One hand belonged to a man trying to keep the ephemeral in check, but he felt the word on its back as an accusation he had to understand. She was not a patient in his clinic that day, beyond a routine visit, and that mattered. He would keep his professional integrity tight as a seam. But the human cost of the distance he had cultivated was suddenly visible: a young woman who could not afford to be careless with trust. He had seen that look before, on faces of people who had learned to measure kindness as a commodity. He wanted, absurdly and privately, to apologize for everything he represented that might feel like a threat. Sophie, when the steady slow worked through her limbs and the nurse allowed her a sip of water, kept her fingers curled around the Polaroid. Daniel rose and crossed the small distance with a professional, almost shy caution, as if proximity itself might be a negotiation. He did not touch her without invitation. He did not speak with the soft, dangerous phrases magazine features use. He simply sat and offered time, and in that offering there was a kind of admission that time, like a patient hand, had its own medicine. "You kept that," he said finally, Voice low, not a question, but a recognition. He motioned to the photograph on the table. The paper crane's corner had been smoothed by years of being folded and unfolded in someone's palm. Sophie clutched it to her chest as if the paper would anchor her. "It's nothing important," she said, though she did not entirely believe the sentence. The word on the back, Hayes, sat between them, an unspoken signpost pointing toward a place they had not yet agreed to enter. He hesitated, then nodded. "It matters," he said. "Small things like that, kindness, matter more than most people realize." Her lips tightened into a dry laugh. "Of course you would say that," she said. "You make your living off it." The joke landed soft against the scatter of machines, and for one strained, honest second, they both laughed at the cruelty and the accuracy of her line. The nurse checked the chart and talked about observation. "Stay for a few hours," she advised. "We'll keep you under observation and make sure there isn't something else going on. Do you have anyone to take you home?" Sophie looked at the question the way people look at a photograph that contains a person you once knew. Her no came out quiet and flat. Daniel almost said something then, offer his car, offer a ride. Part of him wanted to step into the old, clumsy extraness that saved few people from themselves, but he held himself at a distance, the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, dangerously close but ultimately restrained. Instead, he spoke in another voice, one that had nothing to do with expectation and everything to do with a patient tethered to a hospital gurney. "Stay," he said, "if you want. I can make sure someone from the clinic follows up tomorrow." His offer was practical and not possessive. He was offering continuity of care, not a lifeline that would be repaid. He did not seek gratitude. He sought nothing beyond making sure she wouldn't be alone as the stew of anxiety and faintness settled. Sophie saw the quiet in him as if she had been trained to see small things. She measured his eyes for motive and weighed his hands for evidence of leverage. He had been respectful to her in the past. He had left generous tips at the bookstore, yes, but he had also been careful when he offered kindness. There was no swagger, no assumed superiority. Still, a voice low but insistent in her head whispered that his presence could be a form of power. She thought of the article, of the gala photograph, of the way doors opened for him. She did not trust wealth because the world taught people like her that it could be used as currency for affection. "Thank you," she said finally, because she did not know how to refuse something practical and human and suddenly necessary. "If it's not too much trouble." "It isn't," he replied, and the steadiness of his tone was enough for now. When the nurse left the room and the fluorescents hummed, they sat with that small, delicate distance. Not strangers, not friends, not anything maimed. Outside the curtained window, the rain stitched the city back together. Appointments waited. Medicine did what medicine does. Sophie held the Polaroid to her ribs and let it press the memory into her like a secret. Daniel watched her breathe and privately cataloged the things he could offer that were not wrapped in money. Presence, time, reliable kindness that did not require reciprocation. He reminded himself, with an almost painful honesty, that he had made rules for himself that had kept him safe, and that maybe safety in love was a different shape than the kind he could give in a clinical setting. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon cleaner. The monitor told them that a heart kept going, steady and stubborn. They had two ways forward, the careful, professional path and the infinitely messier human one. A pager buzzed somewhere down the corridor, brisk and indifferent. A nurse peeked in to check on vitals and then left a chart on the foot of the bed. Sophie asked about discharge in a voice that was more practical than hopeful. Daniel answered with what he could guarantee. Follow up tomorrow, no strenuous activity, hydration. He did not promise miraculous cures or grand gestures. He could only promise that tomorrow he would be there for what the clinic protocol allowed. As evening deepened outside and the rain settled into a steady drum, Sophie tucked the Polaroid back into the pocket of her cardigan. She did not fold into herself as she had the weeks before. She let herself be looked after, which was its own small defiance.
She had learned that letting someone see you was not the same as expecting them to fix you. There was a fragile distinction between confiding and bargaining. But the night was not done. The city held one more small, indifferent moment in reserve, something that could change the geometry of their lives if it was not handled with care. Sophie felt, like a shadow at the edge of a room, that something was coming, an edge of panic she couldn't place. Her breathing caught, a shallow hitch that wasn't faintness, but the shape of fear itself folding inward. Daniel watched her hand tighten around the photograph and felt a shift in his chest. Not the old recoil that had once sealed him off from people, but a sudden, unwelcome acceleration. He had never been particularly good at surprises. Life, in its messy kindness, had a way of surprising him now and then, and the surprises were not always comfortable. Outside the curtained window, a siren in the far distance rose and fell like an exhale. The city had one more note to strike before the evening resolved, and in the small, incalculable calculus of human moments, it was the one that mattered most. When the discharge nurse finally brought the clipboard with her name on it, Sophie felt both relieved and oddly bereft, the way a person feels after leaving a small, sheltering room and stepping back into the weather. The hospital corridor smelled of coffee and antiseptic and the quiet friction of other people's lives. She folded the fitted sheet around her shoulders like a shawl and let the nurse talk through a list of do's and don'ts. Eat small meals, keep hydrated, call if anything changed. Daniel listened from the chair near the window with a patience that was almost visible, the way someone leans into silence to hold it steady. "Are you sure you don't want someone to go with you?" the nurse asked finally. Sophie shook her head once, the motion brittle and decisive. "I'll be fine," she said, which might have been partly true. The thought of sitting in a taxi and staring at a back of someone's head made her stomach tight. The thought of sitting with Daniel made her palms sweat in a different way. He stood when she did. "I can walk you to the bus stop," he offered, the sentence clean and unassuming. It was a reasonable thing to offer. It was not a gift wrapped in implication. Sophie considered how many times she'd refused help out of pride, and how many times pride had been less about dignity and more about defending herself from owing anyone anything. She said yes. Outside, the rain had moved on to a polite drizzle that made the city glassy. Daniel walked a careful pace beside her, not leading, not lagging. For a few blocks they said nothing, the kind of silence two people who have been recent strangers can share without awkwardness, filled rather than empty. Occasionally, he glanced at the Polaroid tucked into her cardigan. She felt him look at it the way someone looks at a relic. "Why did you keep it?" he asked finally, as if the question were clinical and therefore safe. Sophie toyed with the edge of the photograph, as if smoothing it would make the answer simpler. "Because it mattered," she said. "Someone took a minute to see me when I was small, and that felt like proof that people could be kind for no other reason than being kind." Her voice was thin. She watched the pavement for the next step as if it were a paragraph she had to read aloud. He considered that. "I was taught to think kindness mattered," he said. "I was also taught charities required handshakes and applause. I'm learning there are versions of both." "People like the applause," Sophie said, a small, sharp laugh that did not reach the corners of her mouth. "But sometimes it's the kneeling that counts." They found a cafe that smelled of warm sugar and old paper, a place Sophie sometimes went alone to hide behind a novel. Daniel paused at the door, checking as if the world required permission before he entered. He held it open for her. Inside, the light was the color of butter, and the same song, one of those small, slightly melancholy tunes that made strangers feel forgiving, played low through the speakers. They took a table in the corner with cracked laminate. Neither ordered much, a tea for Sophie, black coffee for Daniel. They occupied an undecorated space between acquaintance and something that might be named later. She placed the Polaroid on the table between them, the paper catching a thin slant of afternoon light. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he said. She had rehearsed the story in her head a dozen ways, and yet somehow the telling stumbled like a child over an unseen curb. "I was at the clinic that winter because our heat went out," she said. "My mom was working extra, and I was small. I remember being cold and embarrassed and a little angry. Her fingers tightened on the photograph. The paper crane looked like the only thing in the world that knew how to hold shape. A volunteer knelt down at a kid's table and folded a paper crane with me. She asked me about my favorite color and then put the crane in my hand like it was important. Someone wrote on the back, just a name actually, Hayes, with a little heart. I don't know why I kept it, I just did. He leaned forward the faintest degree, the way a person leans when they want to map a new constellation. The name on the back lodged in his chest like a small weather vane. Hayes, he repeated, like he didn't finish, because in that fragment of a syllable he felt something real and unwieldy. He knew the way his mother wrote the H, the curl of the downstroke, the little heart she sometimes doodled when she was in a hurry. It was not something he had thought about in years, small domestic things from a life he'd tried not to look at too closely. There were photographs in the study at his boyhood home where she had been captured smiling at the edges of ribbon cuttings, signing her name in neat loops on donation letters. But she had also been a volunteer, quietly taking off her gloves to kneel at a child's level. There were kindnesses he had never known her for when he sat through family events where the charity flashed like a banner. To realize her hand might be on that photograph, an unadvertised kindness, felt to him like finding a lost page from a book he had once loved. For a long second, he said nothing. There was a sound behind his teeth like a key turning slowly, the private mechanism of recognition. My mother, she volunteered at the community clinics years ago, he said finally. He spoke in a way that kept the facts tidy, but the edges raw. She sometimes used her last name. She didn't like the fuss. She'd go under the radar. She could be very gentle in ways that didn't make the newspaper. Sophie's breath hitched at that. Hayes? She asked again, as if asking might make the letters line up differently. He swallowed. Yes. He reached out, not to take the photograph, but to point with a finger at the faint heart drawn at the corner of the name. She used to doodle those little hearts on the margins of notes when I was a kid. It used to make me roll my eyes. I didn't know she... His voice tightened. He had been taught to wield his family's presence as a tool. He had not been taught to notice the quiet work it had sometimes done. I didn't know she'd done that. For a long second, he said nothing. There was a sound behind his teeth like a key turning slowly, the private mechanism of recognition. My mother, she volunteered at the community clinics years ago, he said finally. He spoke in a way that kept the facts tidy, but the edges raw. She sometimes used her last name. She didn't like the fuss. She'd go under the radar. She could be very gentle in ways that didn't make the newspaper. Sophie's breath hitched at that. Hayes? She asked again, as if asking might make the letters line up differently. He swallowed. Yes. He reached out, not to take the photograph, but to point with a finger at the faint heart drawn at the corner of the name. She used to doodle those little hearts on the margins of notes when I was a kid. It used to make me roll my eyes. I didn't know she... His voice tightened. He had been taught to wield his family's presence as a tool. He had not been taught to notice the quiet work it had sometimes done. I didn't know she'd done that. The word had a tilt in it that wore thin into a softer admission. I'm sorry. It was brief, clumsy. It feels strange to say that because I wasn't here then. Not really. I was away a lot. I thought the things people said about my family were the whole of it. Sophie watched him unspool, saw how the professional cord he wore had frayed into private seams. He looked smaller than the photographs she had once seen in the magazine. A man whose hands had learned the steadiness of clinical gestures and who now held a more complicated interior. The shock that had stunned him was not one of surprise that his family had been generous. It was the shock of realizing generosity had reached someone he actually met, someone who was not a headline that needed framing. "Why did you keep it a secret?" she asked, and the question was not accusatory so much as curious. If she did that, why not tell me? He smiled without humor. "I don't know what the answer is," he said. My family has a way of performing charity in public and keeping private things private. Sometimes the private things are the ones you should probably tell people about." The confession opened a space for another. Daniel's shoulders slumped, small and human. "There's something else I should tell you," he said. "Something about why I keep my distance." The sentence was an invitation and a boundary both. "I was betrayed once by someone close to me," he continued. "It was complicated. She used the faith people put in me as leverage. She turned what I thought was trust into a form of currency. After that, I built a lot of rules. No mixing work and feelings, keep things neat. It was how I kept from getting hurt again." Sophie listened. At the center of her chest, behind the Polaroid, a slow, patient empathy began to assemble itself. She had not thought of Daniel as only a man in a magazine suit. She had thought of him as someone whose gentleness often felt like a test. Here was the test spelled plainly. His gentleness had been a risk for him, too. "I was afraid of being seen as someone who wanted things because of your name," she said, quiet. "Not because I wanted help, but because there's a kind of shame that comes with being helped by people who can buy you a life. I'd rather be the person who wears her dignity like a jacket, even if it's threadbare, than someone who takes a check." The bareness of her words cut clean. Daniel's expression softened into something like regret and something like reverence. He reached out, tentative and asking, and brushed his fingertips against the edge of the Polaroid, as if the paper carried permission. "You could have told me anyway," he said. "You didn't have to carry it by yourself." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it had not come out so thin. "I didn't want to be accused of taking anything I didn't earn," she said. "And besides, maybe I thought the kindness looked better as a private thing." Easier to believe that way. They sat with that. The city hummed beyond the windows. No one offered grand solutions. That was, in its own way, another kind of promising. Two people in a cafe, attempting to translate mute history into language that could be shared. When they left, the rain had stopped altogether. Daniel walked her back toward the bus stop with a pace that was now companionable. He did not offer to see her home. Instead, he said he would do the practical thing and call the clinic to alert them she would be resting, and that he would make sure a nurse checked on her in the morning. He kept his promises the way he kept his hands steady, deliberately. Over the next week, they met in small measures. He called once to ask how she was sleeping. She texted him a photograph of the Polaroid tucked into a book on a shelf, nothing more. He stopped dropping by the bookstore openly. He respected the boundaries she had set. But he left a paper bag with a loaf of bread and a single shy note. "For when you forget to be kind to yourself." She found it in the morning when the shop smelled like lemon oil and new paper, and thought of all the ways kindness can come in small, unadvertised forms. The guardrails of his professional life held firm. He did not schedule personal appointments under the clinic's roof. He did not make contact that could be backward mapped to a patient file. When they did speak, it was in public spaces, very intentionally not clinical spaces. They learned the language of small things, favorite authors, the exact way Sophie liked her tea, the story behind the little dent in the spine of a battered novel he loved. They traded fragments. He told her about the betrayal a little more candidly the second time. She told him about nights she had been hungry and proud, and the ways small mercies had seemed profound. Then, one late afternoon, a week after the hospital, Sophie reached for him in a way that surprised them both. She was shelving when the bell over the door rang, and he stepped in, his coat dusted from the rain. He had not told her he would come. Behind him, the streetlight painted the alley soft and anxious. He paused in the doorway, as if considering whether the step into her life should be theatrical or quiet. He chose quiet. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and his voice held the particular stillness of someone who had been practicing being brave. She wiped her hands on a cloth and leaned on the counter, listening. "Yes," she said. He took a breath, the physical kind that makes the ribs change their shape. "Will you join me at the clinic, not as a patient, but as a volunteer? There's a program there, community reading hours, and
He stopped, searching for a phrase that didn't smell like obligation. "I'd like you to help. Not because I want to pay you, and not because I think charity is an answer. Because I think the people who go there deserve someone who understands the quiet work of kindness." Sophie blinked. For a second, she saw 1,000 possible rejections. The worry that he would only offer her something because of power, the fear he'd frame her as a curiosity under a philanthropic banner. But she also saw something else. His hand, steady, not flashy. The smallness of his request, as if asking to sit beside someone and read aloud was a real form of intimacy. She considered how many times she had folded her life around making herself small, and how often that smallness had been taken for granted as a kind of invisibility. "Okay," she said finally, "I'll do it, if you can promise me one thing." "What's that?" "No speeches," she said. "No cameras, just us and some books." He smiled in a way that felt like capitulation and devotion all at once. "No cameras," he promised. On the first day they volunteered together, Sophie carried a box of picture books with the Polaroid pinned inside the lid, not on display, but as a talisman. Children came and sat in a crooked semicircle. Their knees were smudged with playground dust and impatience. Daniel read with a voice that made attention seem like an offering. Sophie folded cranes with them, fingers fumbling, instructions soft and patient. The volunteers clapped when the hour ended. Small applause, the kind that doesn't get printed in newspapers. Afterwards, Daniel walked with her to the little cafe on the corner. He thanked her again for coming, and she, because small trade-offs still frightened her, asked the question that had been settling like a stone. "Why do you keep trying?" she said, because she wanted to know the real answer that wasn't policy or headline. Why keep showing up in small ways when you could make a spectacle and be done? He looked at her, and in his face, something that had been behind a wall of protocol broke like sunlight through glazing. "Because I've learned the hard way that spectacle is loud and private help is quiet," he said. Then, quieter, "because the person I was when I started, reckless and certain, wasn't mine to be proud of. I want to be better than that." She watched him reach for the Polaroid in the box lid and touch the faded heart, as if he were blessing something. "I thought I wanted to be in control of how I let people help me," she admitted. "Turns out, control is boring and lonely." They laughed at that, low and shared, and the laugh made the world small enough to fit just the two of them for a breath. The memory reveal, the thing that would change the geometry of their relationship, did not arrive with drama. It came in the slow burn of a Saturday afternoon, in a clumsy, sincere lunch he brought to her at the bookstore. She had closed early that day to keep her nerves from fraying, and found him waiting with sandwiches wrapped in brown paper and a bookmark sticking out of his pocket like a nervous flag. "Open it," he said. He set the sandwich down and extracted the bookmark. It was the same battered, dog-eared thing she had always used, the one she'd once found in the pocket of a book she recommended to a stranger. When she took it, her thumb brushed a fold tucked into the corner, a tiny paper crane, perfect in miniature, bound with a single thread of red floss. Her breath nearly stopped. The crane was folded in the exact way the volunteer had shown the child in the Polaroid years ago. She turned to look at him. He watched her like someone not used to seeing such an immediate reaction to a private thing. "I found this in my mother's things after she died," he said, voice low. "She kept journals and letters, little scraps. I found a stack of bookmarks with cranes folded into them, and one had a note, 'For Sophie, stay brave.' I thought it was for someone I'd never meet." Sophie's fingers tightened around the paper. "Sophie?" she echoed, the name an echo that traveled from the past to the present and back again, as if two histories had collided in something as small as a word. He nodded. "She used to go to the clinic under the radar. She'd